How's everybody doing? I'm Dr. Buffano. This is my lecture series on Middle East politics. For our next lecture, we're going to be discussing why the peace process broke down in Israel and Palestine. So this will be our last lecture on the topic of Israel and Palestine. We're going to discuss why the Oslo Accords failed, as well as what started the Gaza Wars and their impact on the region. So let's get started here. Let me share my screen with all of you. Okay. All right, so in our last lecture in this series, we talked about the reasons for the beginnings of the Oslo peace process. And we talked about the agreements that the Israeli government, led by the Labor Party and Yitzhak Rabin, came to with Fatah. That's the Arab nationalist organization that had been leading the Palestinian Liberation Organization for several decades. In the early 1990s, they came together to engage in this peace process, right? And so they agreed that on a two-state solution, and they would take approximately 5 years to hammer out the details on challenges such as the return of refugees, the issues of settlements in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, as well as what to do about Jerusalem. So they agreed to this, but unfortunately, what's going to happen is this peace process is going to break down. They are not going to create two separate states by the end of this. Instead, we're going to see a return to violent conflict. So we want to, in this lecture, understand why the Oslo peace process failed. On top of it as well, we want to understand why violence began again. What caused the Second Intifada and the Gaza Wars? So we're going to learn about the causes of these conflicts. And of course, we're going to talk about what happened on October 6, 2023 and its aftermath. And we're also in the process going to understand why it is that Palestine is politically divided between Hamas and Fatah. Hopefully, by the end of this lecture, you should understand that political currents within Israel and Palestine are incredibly diverse, and there are debates about the future of this region. So, first, why do peace processes break down? Well, of course, part of it can have to do with the challenges and the negotiations between the moderate actors that engage in them, right? Of course, there's a lot of difficulties with the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. How to deal, for example, with the challenges of Israeli settlements in the West Bank is one of the big ones. But another big challenge here had to do with spoilers. Spoilers are radicals on each side of the divide that are opposed to the peace process, and they could sometimes disrupt it or even outright derail it. Now, on the Israeli side, you had spoilers. So the supporters of the peace process were the Labor Party and what we call liberal Zionists, right? So individuals like Yitzhak Rabin, while they were Zionists, they believed in a Jewish state. They believed that a Jewish state could coincide with the existence of a Palestinian one, and that the Holy Land could be divided between these two peoples. Yitzhak Rabin is the liberal politician, that labor politician, right, that led the negotiations with the Palestinians during the Oslo Accords. They were opposed, though, from the get-go, from the beginning, by the Likud party. The Likud party, they're religious Zionists. These are individuals that are opposed to the peace process, and they want a single state for Israelis. They believe that the Holy Land should belong to the Jews and the Jews alone. And so many religious Zionists in Israel believe giving up any territory is heresy. So while Yitzhak Rabin was negotiating, the opposition in Israeli parliament was strongly against Oslo, the peace process, giving up settlements, allowing refugees the right to return. They were a constant roadblock to this process. Now, their motivations, the Likud party and the far right in Israel, are not just based on religious ideology. Part of this also has to do with economic motivations. Israeli settlers are some of the most conservative right-wing individuals in Israeli society, partly because of the economic motivations. They don't want to give up their territory to the Palestinians. They have a lot to lose economically in the process. Now, in contrast, Israelis that live in the coastal regions, live in cities like Tel Aviv, they tend to be much more liberal in nature, much more progressive in nature. So you see a kind of urban-rural divide, a coastal versus interior divide within Israel here between liberals and conservatives. Kind of like what you see in the United States, for example, today with the blue states versus the red states. So what's going to happen here is during the Oslo process, we're going to see a shift in Israeli politics from the left to the right because of the talks, because of the fact that you get agreements like the Gaza Jericho agreement, right? There was suddenly this really growth in the right wing within Israel. There's a lot of people who are fearful they were going to lose their lands, their settlements. And Yitzhak Rabin was eventually assassinated by a radical on the religious right in 1995. And shortly thereafter, the Likud party won elections in 1996. And so once the Likud won elections, the government is going to suddenly turn against the peace process. They are going to, for example, reverse the policies on land settlement expansion. They're going to start to once again expand land settlements in the West Bank. In fact, they're going to double in the late 1990s the number of settlements that existed, contrary to what was agreed upon with the Oslo Accords. So they are going to derail the peace process, the Likud party here, under the leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, we don't just see spoilers, though, on the Israeli right. We also see spoilers on the Palestinian right. Now, if you remember, the peace process was supported by Fatah, the Harakat al-Tahrir al-Filistiniya, the movement for Palestinian resistance. They were part of this larger organization called the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and they were left-wing, they were Arab nationalists, and during the late 1980s, for reasons we discussed in the last lecture, they came to the negotiation table with the Labour Party, and they agreed to the Oslo Accords. Now, not all Palestinians agreed to them, and one of the biggest opponents was Hamas, an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood we talked about last lecture. They were Islamists that were not in favor of the Oslo Accords. All right, now, just like with the religious Zionists, many Islamists believe that the Holy Land belongs to Muslims. So whereas with the Arab nationalists, the left, their big gripe was with the Israelis had more to do with the fact that they saw this as settler colonialism. They saw this as just another example of Europeans colonizing Arab lands. For the Islamists, they also really saw a strong religious dynamic to this. They believed that the Holy Land, it belonged to Muslims. And so this kind of phrase from the river to the sea, whereas the Likud party believed it belonged to the Jews, the Islamists such as Hamas believed it belongs to Muslims. Now, of course, there was also an economic dimension to this resistance. There were many Palestinians that did not like the outcome of the Oslo Accords, particularly the Oslo II agreement, which actually gave most Palestinian lands to the Israelis, right? That agreement created 3 zones within the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and one of those zones was still controlled by the Israeli state. In fact, 71% of the water would continue to be controlled by the Israelis within what was supposed to become a future Palestinian state. So many Palestinians did not trust the Oslo Accords. They didn't like the direction it was headed in. And to make matters worse, once Fatah was elected and they gained control of the new Palestinian Authority in 1996, they were accused in the aftermath of that of engaging in a lot of corruption. Many leaders of Fatah would use their positions of power to enrich themselves. Many accused Fatah of not speaking out strongly enough against the Likud party when they began expanding their settlements. You know, Fatah continued with this kind of conciliatory rhetoric towards the Israeli government, even after the Likud won elections and began to re-expand settlements. And so there was a lot of anger with Fatah. Many felt that they were clinging on to power and not doing enough to stand up for Palestinian interests. And so many individuals began to leave the PLO and began to join organizations such as Hamas and other Islamist groups within Palestine. So what we start to see happen here is support for the spoilers grow on both sides of the aisle. The Likud party and Hamas start to gain in popularity, while the Labour Party and Fatah start to lose their popularity. And this here is Benjamin Netanyahu. Since 1996, the Likud party has controlled the Israeli government for all of about 2 years. So they've pretty much dominated the state since this time period. And for most of those years, it's been Benjamin Netanyahu that has been in charge of the Likud party. And so he's been a spoiler in the peace process. And so eventually what's going to happen is the peace process breaks down. In the year 2000, we see the breakdown of what is called the Second Intifada, the second outbreak of mass protest by Palestinians. Now, what sparked the Second Intifada? Well, what happened was a Likud leader, his name was Ariel Sharon, he is going to decide to visit a Muslim section of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Now, if you remember, the Temple Mount is divided between the Wailing Wall, sacred to Jews, and the Dome of the Rock and al-Aqsa Mosque, which sits atop of the Temple Mount, which belongs to Muslims. And of course, while Jews visit the bottom of the Temple Mount and the Wailing Wall, Muslims, they visit the top. Well, Ariel Sharon decided to commit a taboo. As a Jewish political leader, he decided to visit the top of the Temple Mount. This is going to spark an outcry and mass protest, with many Palestinians believing that the Israelis are getting ready to, kick all Palestinians out of East Jerusalem. So this sparks the Al-Aqsa Intifada, the Second Intifada, the mass outbreak of protests. And so, like the First Intifada, we see the mass outbreak of, civil unrest within Palestine. But what made this different from the First Intifada is that this was far more violent and aggressive. The First Intifada used peaceful civil disobedience more so than violent conflict. But this one, we are going to see Palestinians become more aggressive. It was led by more militant groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad. They engaged in acts of terrorism. Not only did they attack Israeli security forces, they also attacked as well Israeli civilians using things like bombings. And they declared a jihad against the Israeli state. They began to use suicide bombings, terrorism, the use of improvised explosive devices. Now, of course, in typical Likud party fashion and typical Israeli fashion, they're going to respond to this violence with even more violence. They're going to reoccupy all Palestinian territory in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. So they're going to reverse the Oslo Accords. They're going to reoccupy all of the territory there. So they're going to strip the PA, the Palestinian Authority, of its power. And in the process, over 3,000 Palestinians are going to be killed, along with over 1,000 Israelis being killed in the process as well. Thousands of Palestinians as well were imprisoned. Many were tortured. We see the suspending, for example, of habeas corpus. Lots of human rights abuses were committed here. So lots of violent conflict. And much has been written about the Second Intifada. I recommend the book, The Road to Martyrs Square. This is a book that was written on the phenomena of suicide bombing. Why would someone be willing to blow themselves up? And they talk as well a lot about this concept shaheed, which in Arabic means martyr. So a lot of these jihadists believe that if they were martyred for their cause, they would go to heaven. Right? So there was a religious dynamic to the Second Intifada here that was very strong. And of course, part of this book also talks about the humiliation of occupation, military occupation, and how this just led to a lot of mass anger and disillusionment. And so what happens is a lot of Palestinians are going to give up on the peace process here, along with many Israelis. Now, what brought an end to the Second Intifada? Well, what happened is eventually Yasser Arafat is going to die in 2004, very old man by this point. He is going to be replaced by Mahmoud Abbas, and he's going to try to sit down at the negotiation table with groups like Hamas, as well as with the Israeli government, to try to bring an end to the violence. And for their part, the Israelis, realizing that they were having problems containing the violence, over 1,000 Israelis have been killed. The Likud party is also going to try to sit down at the negotiation table. President George W. Bush at the time is going to try as well to get the different sides to the table. And eventually, a summit is held in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. It's a tourist resort in the Sinai Peninsula. In 2005, they're going to come together. And a peace summit eventually is agreed upon. So in 2005, they sit down. Mahmoud Abbas, who at the time was the head of the PA, he is going to agree to help prevent attacks on Israelis. During the Second Intifada, Fatah really, became very apathetic about what was taking place. And the Israelis felt like that Fatah and the PA was not doing enough to stop terrorist attacks. So Mahmoud Abbas agrees, okay, we're going to help prevent terrorist attacks. We're going to crack down upon it within the Palestinian territories. In return, the prime minister at the time, the leader of the Likud party was Ariel Sharon. He agrees to release Palestinians from prison. And he also agrees to end the occupation of the Gaza Strip and parts of the West Bank. And so they're going to go back to that Oslo II agreement where they're going to allow the PA once again to have some control over territories within the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And they also agree as well that they're going to hold new elections. They hadn't held elections in a decade because of the outbreak of the Second Intifada. And George W. Bush felt that by holding new elections, this could calm people down and it could perhaps lead to a kickstart to the Oslo Agreement, right? We could get the peace agreements back and going again. And so what ends up happening? Well, they hold elections in 2006, and the results were shocking. Now, Mahmoud Abbas, the head of Fatah, he won presidential elections. This wasn't shocking. There was the expectation that Fatah was going to win. There was this kind of idea in the minds of a lot of Westerners and Israelis that Yasser Arafat's party, that Fatah, held the hearts and minds of Palestinians. But the reality is that support for Hamas had been growing, and Hamas won a plurality of seats in the legislature. This sent shockwaves throughout the Western world, throughout Israel. Many Palestinians voted for Hamas. Now, not all of these Palestinians, by the way, were true Islamists. Some voted for Hamas as a protest vote, as a protest against the Oslo Accords, as a protest against Fatah and their corrupt governance. So Hamas wins a plurality of the seats. And this was a time, by the way, in fact, you still see it within Hamas's founding charter, they call for the destruction of Israel. So Israel and the United States rejects these elections, and eventually Fatah is going to come to reject this as well. So you have a situation where the United States and Israel is not going to accept the results here of the election. And what then takes place is an internal conflict within the Palestinian movement. Hamas and Fatah are going to start to engage in a civil war with one another in 2007. And what's going to end up happening here is Hamas is going to take control of the Gaza Strip. It's a little strip of land right on the Mediterranean coast. And no elections have been held since. So Hamas takes control of the Gaza Strip, and they have controlled it ever since. Fatah is going to take control of the West Bank, at least the territories that don't involve Israeli settlements. And once again, no election has been held ever since. So since 2006, Palestinians have not been able to go to the polls. So we don't know who the legitimate individuals are who should be running Palestine because there have not been elections since this time period. Okay, and here we have just a map of this. Hamas controls the Gaza Strip here, and parts of the West Bank are controlled by Fatah. And so thus Palestine is divided politically. Ismail Haniyeh, he would serve as the head of Hamas, at least of its political wing, from 2006 up until his assassination in 2024. And Mahmoud Abbas would rule Fatah from 2004 to the present. There has not been an election since 2006. So Palestine is politically divided, and despite attempts by both sides, at various points in time, to try to create a unity movement, they have failed to do so thus far. Now, what would happen once Hamas takes control of the Gaza Strip? Obviously, Israel would reject this, right? So Israel has blockaded the Gaza Strip since 2007. A blockade is when you try to suffocate a region economically by not allowing goods in. So not only has Israel at various points in time tried to prevent weapons from coming into the Gaza Strip, they've also tried to prevent even things like food aid and economic assistance. Out of, their justification is, they argue, this aid will end up in the arms of Hamas. Opponents of Israel have accused the Israelis of purposely causing suffering amongst the Palestinian people. Because of this blockade, the average person in Gaza earns less than $1,000 a year. Unemployment is well over half of the population. There are many people that are on the verge of starvation within the Gaza Strip today. Now, on top of this as well, Israel also increased checkpoints and settlements in the West Bank in response to the Second Intifada. Settlements have continued to grow within the West Bank as well, and this has hurt their relations with Fatah, who they've grown increasingly distant from the Israelis as a consequence of this. And peace talks have not progressed. Now, they talk. They talk all the time, throwing out solutions, but oftentimes these solutions are not realistic. They, especially when it's Hamas and the Likud party throwing out their solutions. So it's just peace talks have stalled. There has not been any significant progress since then. Now, what has also happened as well is an uptick in violence that has grown worse. Israel and Hamas have fought 4 wars since Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip in 2008, 2012, 2014, and the most recent in 2023. These wars have often been sparked by things like terrorist attacks committed by Hamas, Israel announcements of expanding settlements, Israeli settler attacks on Palestinian civilians, or Palestinian attacks on Israeli settlers. These sorts of incidents have sparked conflicts, and they've also sparked 4 major wars here. And this warfare, by the way, was not like the Arab-Israeli wars we talked about in a previous lecture. These Arab-Israeli wars were fought as traditional wars by militaries on the battlefield with clearly drawn battle lines. This war, in contrast, the Gaza Wars, is going to consist of what's called asymmetrical warfare, more typical in our modern world today. Now, what is asymmetrical warfare? This is when you have warfare between two sides that are not even on the battlefield. One side is much stronger than the other, so the weaker side has to use non-traditional tactics like guerrilla warfare. So Hamas, for its part, they can't meet the Israeli military directly on the battlefield. So they engage in things like suicide bombings, for example. They engage in kidnappings and they take hostages. They use homemade rockets. They've imported a lot of parts, smuggling them in from the Gaza Strip from countries like Iran. They assemble them within the Gaza Strip and then fire them at Israel. The quality of these homemade rockets is not very good, so they have not killed many Israelis with these rockets. They have killed some Israelis, but they haven't been able to kill as many, in contrast to how many people the Israelis have killed. They also have built tunnels under the Gaza Strip. They engage in a lot of hit and run tactics. So they've engaged in this asymmetrical warfare. Hamas, quite frankly, is not as well armed as the Israelis. The Israelis, in contrast, control a modern state. The Israelis have an economy that is doing very well, so the average person earns over $35,000 a year. The Israelis have nuclear weapons. They have over $4 billion in aid from the United States. They have an air force and a navy and a very well-equipped military. And so thus, the Israelis can use more really more conventional techniques. They've engaged in bombing campaigns on the Gaza Strip. They have what's called an Iron Dome, where they could shoot down Hamas's missiles, very sophisticated air defense system. They also, as well, use their navy. So they have a navy to blockade the Gaza Strip, and they have used their military at various points for ground incursions, sending their military into the Gaza Strip. And so what has happened as a result is that Palestinians with each and every single one of these wars have been disproportionately killed, and civilians have faced the brunt of the destruction as a consequence. And I'm going to show you the data on this in a second. Now, of course, these wars have been framed differently by the international community, by different media outlets. Amongst supporters of the Palestinians, particularly within the Islamic world, we can see here with Al Jazeera, they emphasize this as being an act of genocide, right? The Israelis are trying to exterminate the people of Gaza, as well as Palestinians more generally. And of course, there is a lot of evidence to back this up. We have seen hundreds of thousands of Palestinians killed in these conflicts. Millions of refugees get created. The Israelis have continued to build settlements during this conflict. And we can see here Al Jazeera here showing some of the statistics. We have here the Gaza Strip has been blockaded. Gaza today, its population consists, 64% of it consists of refugees living in refugee camps. You have 2 million people living in this tiny little territory. And since 2008, there have been 4 major wars. I know it says 3 wars here because this image comes from the year 2000. There has since been a 4th war that has been fought. And by the way, this blockade does not exist without the help of Egypt. We can see here Egypt has closed off the Rafah crossing, has not allowed weapons to enter into the Gaza Strip. Now, the Israelis and their supporters, particularly within much of the American media, have promoted a different narrative here. They argue that anti-Semitism is rife throughout the Middle East and North Africa, that the Israelis are besieged by enemies. They also argue that Hamas is engaging in acts of terrorism, which is also a violation of international law. They argue that Hamas is using the civilians as human shields within the Gaza Strip, that, they'll fire rockets from a civilian building like a hospital, and thus this is why the Israelis are bombing civilian targets. And so they argue that it's Hamas that's in the wrong here. Now, of course, supporters of Palestine have argued back that it's an occupation, right? And the fact is that Hamas is operating within this very densely populated civilian city. They have no choice but to fire rockets from civilian buildings. And so we have here these kind of arguments and debates that are going back and forth. This rhetoric, by the way, comes from the Israeli Defense Forces. And as you can see here, regardless of the rhetoric, let's look at the death toll. As you can see here, from the Second Intifada, you can see here in the early 2000s, and then we've got our major wars, the 2008, 2012, and 2014 wars. Notice that the vast majority of deaths have been Palestinians, and specifically, they have been Palestinian civilians. They have borne the brunt of this, and a large percentage of these Palestinian civilians have been children. So the death toll has been horrifying. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have been killed. The number of Israelis that have been killed have been relatively small in comparison here because of the asymmetrical warfare. Now, the most recent war had started in 2023. This one started with a Hamas terrorist attack, right? So Hamas engaged in a sneak attack on an Israeli settlement. They killed over 1,000 Israelis in this attack, and they took dozens of people hostage in the process. And in response to this, of course, Israelis are going to end up bombing the Gaza Strip. Now, this terrorist attack was supported by Hamas's proxy allies. This conflict would not have been possible, or those previous conflicts, without Hamas receiving support from Iran and Iran's proxies such as Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthi in northern Yemen. Iran, which had an Islamic revolution in 1979, has been supporting the Palestinian cause ever since, and they've become pretty much Israel's enemy number one within the region. So Hamas has been receiving a lot of support from Iran. Israel, in response, has engaged in a devastating bombing campaign, often an indiscriminate bombing campaign. Over 50,000 Palestinians have been killed. The death toll is probably higher at that by this point. We're probably not going to know something close to the true death toll until this conflict actually ends. And they're going to engage in a ground invasion of Gaza. And it was supported by the United States. Because Hamas has an intricate series of tunnels, they've been able to keep up the fight for well over a year and a half, and it's still ongoing to this day. 60% of Gaza's buildings have been either partially or completely destroyed in the process as well, so its infrastructure has been devastated. And of course, the United States has given pretty much carte blanche to Israel to engage in really this horrifying bombing campaign. So they give the Israelis $4 billion a year in aid. And as I said, the Egyptians are helping with the blockade. And kind of what's surprising, and what might surprise you as a listener is actually a lot of Arab states are very much in support of the Israelis, even if they don't really say so out loud. The Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Arab Gulf, have been pretty much quiet about this, right? So it's been Iran and its proxies, such as Hezbollah and the Houthi, that have been more loud and outspoken and have engaged in helping Hamas with this war. So because of the international nature of this, Israel has bombed southern Lebanon and Hezbollah has sent rockets over to Israel. We have the Houthi in northern Yemen that have attacked Western targets, such as oil tankers that have been going through the Red Sea, and the United States and Israel have bombed targets in northern Yemen. Now, the International Court of Justice and other international institutions, such as the General Assembly, have accused both Israel and Hamas of engaging in war crimes. Governments such as South Africa have also accused Israel of engaging in genocide. And of course, a lot of academics argue Israel is committing ethnic cleansing here by trying to remove people from the land. So we've got acts of terrorism, we have acts of collective violence against civilians. It's been horrifying. Now, for my classroom, I, have them engage in this kind of discussion about the future here. First, is a two-state solution possible? Well, the Oslo Accords argued for a two-state solution. There are many challenges going forward that make a two-state solution very difficult. Number one, there are hundreds of Israeli settlements in the West Bank. Israelis are entrenched in territory that's supposed to become part of a future Palestinian state. It's going to be very difficult getting Israelis to move out of those settlements. Furthermore, there are hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees living abroad. And if those Israelis don't leave those settlements, those Palestinians won't have a place of return. This is one of the challenges of a two-state solution. Other big challenges is how to divide Jerusalem itself. Can we actually divide Jerusalem, given that the Wailing Wall and the Dome of the Rock are located right on top of each other? This is known as the indivisibility problem. Like, can we divide the Holy Land in a way that would make both sides happy, especially the religious right on both sides? Now, of course, on the other hand, a one-state solution, comes with its own set of challenges. So let's imagine we just decide to create one state that is secular and respects the rights of Muslims, Christians, and Jews to live in this single state. Well, the question then becomes, can these two sides coexist given the recent history of bloodshed, the animosity? There's a great deal of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia across both sides of the aisle here. So this is another great challenge to solving this conflict. And on top of this as well, will the, Israelis be happy with the situation if they're one day in the minority, right? Where Muslims suddenly have a majority, or vice versa, right? Would Muslims be happy living under a majority Jewish state? So this is another challenge here. And then, this kind of also goes into the, question, is peace in the region possible at all over this issue? Arab Muslim states, as well as other Muslim states throughout the world, have been using this issue as a kind of rally around the flag effect. Anti-Semitism is rife throughout the Middle East, particularly in states like Iran and amongst groups such as Hezbollah. There's a lot of animosity because of the fighting with the Israeli state in the past. Is it possible for them to engage in peace, right? And to overcome these animosities. And on top of that as well, within the United States, the United States has been supporting Israel pretty much since the end of World War II, right? And we have a strong Christian Zionist movement here in the United States. There's a lot of Islamophobic and anti-Palestinian rhetoric in America. Can the United States ever come to, take a more neutral, moderate stance on this issue? And so there's a lot of pessimists out there, right? But I do have to, we do have to keep in mind that peace is not impossible. Northern Ireland for decades had a conflict between Catholics and Protestants that was known as the Troubles. It involved terrorism. It involved violence and a lot of animosity. But eventually, the Good Friday Agreement was signed in 1998, and peace was achieved. So this idea that peace is not possible, I think, is it's an exaggeration. Peace can be achieved, but I do think that dynamics have to change on the ground. There has to be a change in the hearts and minds of not only Israelis and Palestinians, but people within the region and within the United States. There has to be a stop to the bloodshed. There has to be a stop to the killing of civilians. The ethnic cleansing has to stop. And at the same time as well, more international pressure needs to be placed on both sides, and particularly the Israelis. Let's be realistic here. The Israelis have most of the political power, right? This has been an asymmetrical conflict for quite some period of time. And if more pressure is not put on the Israeli state, it's just, I have to envision the possibility that full ethnic cleansing is going to take place where all of the Palestinians are going to be kicked off their land. So this is one possibility. Of course, the hatred is rife amongst the Palestinian side. We've seen plenty of acts of terrorism, but much of the power here really is on the side of the Israelis with this conflict now, given the circumstances. Now, the final thing, should the United States continue giving aid to Israel? Well, of course, you can make a lot of good arguments for why an Israeli or even a Jewish state is needed within at least some part of the world due to the history of the Holocaust, the amount of anti-Semitism that exists. Perhaps a state should exist there for the Israeli people. However, at the same time, supporting the existence of the Israeli state does not mean that we should support the lack of existence of a Palestinian state, or that the Palestinians do not deserve the right of self-determination or a voice or the right to elect their own government officials. Every group of individuals deserves the right to sovereignty, the right to choose their own politicians. And so thus, perhaps either this aid should be conditional or be suspended until a two-state solution is agreed upon. Of course, supporters of aid to Israel argue that if aid to Israel stops, that this will galvanize support for Palestinians in the region and that this will lead to the elimination of the Israeli state. Certainly, while this is a possibility, I do need to really emphasize here the asymmetrical nature. Israel has nuclear weapons. They are the great power of this region. So I'm not sure if, cutting off Israeli aid is going to lead to the collapse of the Israeli state. I highly doubt that. So, but anyway, this is a controversial issue, right? And, what is the right solution to this? How go about this? I am not sure. But I do know one thing for certain. No civilians, especially children, should be killed in a conflict. So regardless of who is to blame, I think the international community needs to do everything it can to protect innocent people here, regardless of what their race, religion, creed is, okay? So that does it for my lecture. Of course, feel free to have any comments or disagreements. I know how controversial and how heated of an issue this is. Feel free to disagree. Write your comments below. I'll try to respond them as quickly as I can. So have